Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our lecture today on religious faith in a secular age. My name is Robert Kranak. I'm a professor of political science here at Colgate University. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Freedom and Western Civilization, which is the principal sponsor of this event today, with the support of the Office of the President. It's my pleasure to introduce Ross Douthat, and that is the correct pronunciation, Douthat, not Douthat. He's heard mispronunciations over the years, Douthat, who is our guest speaker today. Ross is well known as an American political analyst, best known as a writer for the New York Times, where his opinion columns appear twice weekly on topics such as religion, politics, moral and cultural issues, and higher education. Before joining the New York Times, Ross was a senior analyst at The Atlantic and a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He was educated at Harvard University and lives today in Connecticut with his wife and 4 children. Ross has written 5 books on a variety of topics, including The State of Christianity in America and Questions of Moral Decadence in Contemporary Society. Some of his provocative titles are Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. In inviting Ross Douthat to Colgate, I've asked him to address a question and a topic that many students avoid, namely the spiritual condition of contemporary society, and especially the challenge of religious faith in a secular age. Ross will speak for about 45 minutes, and I'm sure you'll find his thoughts provocative and original. And I urge you to ask questions when he's done speaking after about 45 minutes. And please don't be shy. Ask him hard questions, challenge him. If you disagree with him, it will make it much more interesting if you engage him. And I'm sure you'll get a provocative and interesting answer. So please join me in welcoming Ross Douthat to Colgate University for our talk today. Thank you.
Is this good? Can everyone? Yes? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Bob, for that incredibly kind introduction, including the clinic on the pronunciation of my last name. I decided to go into journalism mostly in order to spread the gospel of how you pronounce Douthat, so that future generations of Douthats would not be burdened with crippling anxiety whenever their kindergarten teacher called on them. So I appreciate you're doing your part for that project. And it's really a privilege to be with all of you today. And as Bob said, I'm going to talk for a little while about questions connected to the condition of religion in America today. And I'm going to try and do, a fairly wide-ranging discussion to give a little bit of historical perspective on how we ended up where we are today, to talk a bit about sort of the actual spiritual landscape in America at the moment, and end probably on a fairly tentative note, because I think we're actually in a fairly unsettled moment where the future is fairly unpredictable, and hopefully that very unpredictability will yield itself to an interesting discussion in the Q&A. And I would certainly second the suggestion that if you find anything that I say absurd or ridiculous or just unconvincing, you should by all means challenge me directly. And I see this has sort of slid down. Let's see if I put it. Well, we'll see how this goes, how the Holy Spirit moves it along the table as we go, or maybe I'll just lean my hand here. So I think you can see the story of American religion over the last 60 to 70 years as a story of institutional religion's retreat and the resilience of spiritual and religious impulses, notwithstanding that institutional decline. And so to understand the retreat, I think it's worth going back really about 3 generations now, to the period in American history immediately after the Second World War. And I think there's a, sort of fairly common way of thinking about the relationship between religion and secular society and religion and modern life, that imagines religion to have been basically in a kind of constant state of retreat ever since some particular moment. Maybe it's, the trial of Galileo, maybe it's Charles Darwin, but, that there's some sort of inflection point where we enter into modernity. And then, as you go further back into the past, religious institutions are always stronger. And as you get closer to the present, religious institutions are always weaker. And from the vantage point of the United States, circa, let's say, 1955 or so, that story wouldn't really have made a lot of sense. Because in many ways, the story of American history from the period of the American Revolution all the way to the Eisenhower era was a story of institutional religion's steadily growing influence in American life. Now, that doesn't mean that Americans in their personal beliefs just became more and more religious. Every decade, people were just more intense about their belief in God. No, that's not necessarily the case. And certainly, everything from Darwinism to industrialization to the rise of socialism and fascism had some kind of particular influence on how intellectuals in particular thought about religion. But if you just sort of look at American church membership, right, from the 18th century through the middle of the 20th century, what you see there is a story of American churches and, primarily Christian churches, though you can fit the Jewish experience somewhat into this story as well, growing stronger and stronger, basically, in terms of how many people were members of churches. There's a book from now, it's about 20 years old, by a couple of sociologists of religion, Rodney Stark and Roger Fink, that was called The Churching of America. And in that book, they basically chart church membership and see a kind of uninterrupted, or, with some fluctuations here and there, but a pretty steady story of growth, again, from the late 18th century down to the middle of the 20th century. More and more Americans were likely to say that they belong to a church, a denomination, a religious institution as American society developed. And this was particularly true in the post-World War II era, where, you had a bunch of different factors driving increasing interest in religion and increasing membership in churches. You had sort of sociological factors. You had the GIs returning from World War II. There was a surge in marriage. There was a surge in having kids that we now remember, fondly or not, depending on what you think about your grandparents, as the baby boom. And this drove suburbanization, people moving out of cities into newly built suburbs. It drove a growth in church membership. As people got married and had kids, they were more likely to join churches. They were more likely to build churches. The growth of the suburbs also saw this explosion of church building in American life. So those were sort of sociological forces at that moment, sort of making American churches grow. But then there were also sort of ideological, intellectual, theological currents. If you look at that era in American life, in terms of sort of the sort of high level arguments about religion and the influence of religion in politics, you see this really interesting kind of convergence between different American Christian groups, right, who had been sort of more divided and more distant from each other in the pre-World War II period, but in the post-World War II period seemed to be converging on, a kind of religious common ground. Right. So you can take a bunch of different examples. You can take the example of the American Catholic Church. Right. This is an immigrant church, a church associated with Irish and Italian and Eastern European immigration that was for a long time regarded suspiciously by a lot of Protestant Americans, suspected of, secret or not so secret loyalties to the Pope that made it questionable whether Catholics could be full and true Americans. It was an immigrant church, so there was sort of nativist hostility to American Catholicism. And it always had this role as sort of an outsider, kind of slightly exotic, maybe slightly slightly suspicious or worthy of suspicion force in American life. This is true down through the 19th century into the early 20th century. But by the middle of the 20th century, you'd reached this interesting point where Catholicism was still sort of retained a lot of the resilience and sort of sense of solidarity and strong identity of being a kind of immigrant church, a church of, that had a sort of sense of its own outsider status in American life. But there had also been sufficient assimilation that a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice had diminished. And there was a strong sense that, Catholics were just as American as anybody else. And you can see this illustrated in a lot of movies from that period with sort of heroic priests running orphanages and so on. You could see it illustrated in a figure like Fulton Sheen, who was a Catholic bishop who had a kind of Oprah Winfrey style talk show on national television, where he would often stand in front of not a whiteboard, but a blackboard, and sort of talk about theological concepts in a kind of popularizing way while dressed in the full regalia of a pre-Second Vatican Council Catholic bishop, the big cross and so on, right? And this would have been unimaginable in the America of 1890, even if there had been television back then. But in mid-century America, it sort of made sense that a Catholic bishop could be a kind of primetime television figure speaking to a national audience as a kind of religious authority. So Catholicism moves towards the religious mainstream evangelicalism in this period. It had been sort of associated in the popular mind with opposition to the theory of evolution, with the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s. There was sort of a stereotype of evangelical Christians as backwoods fundamentalists, having their, revival circuit meetings way out in the country, but having nothing to do with sort of modern urban cosmopolitan life. And then in the 1950s, you get a figure like Billy Graham, the sort of great national evangelist, sort of the leading figure of a kind of modern evangelicalism, who could go to Madison Square Garden in New York City, who could go to Boston, who could go to Chicago and host a revival that, would get favorable coverage from the New York Times, now my employer, right? That would, bring tens of thousands of people out in what was, sort of the most secular part of America, urban America, highly educated America, who were going to these revivals, right? And sort of demonstrating a kind of face for evangelical Christianity that seemed sort of well suited to the urban, modern, cosmopolitan world, not just a kind of throwback, a backwoods phenomenon, but a phenomenon of, what was then the most modern world imaginable, the world of 1955. What could be more modern than 1955, right? So Catholicism moves towards the center, evangelical Christianity moves towards the center, what we call mainline Protestantism, which are sort of, the big, what were then the big denominations of sort of official established Protestantism, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopalian, and so on. Those churches were sort of enjoying their last big surge in membership. And it was sort of, they had been sort of the traditional custodians of, the churches of the American establishment, associated with the Ivy League, associated with the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. And this was sort of the last moment in American history when they held that place, when you could have famous Protestant theologians who would be on the cover of Time magazine. Of course, Time magazine itself no longer matters, but there was a time when being on the cover of Time magazine was sort of the, the quintessence, the ultimate sort of expression of middlebrow popularity in America. And so you would have, famous theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, sort of, succeeding presidents and dictators on the cover of this national magazine, because their kind of Protestantism was still seen as a sort of centrally influential force in American life. And then finally, you had the Black church, the African-American church, which historically had been obviously the most oppressed and mistreated form of American Christianity, the most marginalized in many ways, suddenly surges to the center of the national political consciousness because of the civil rights movement, because of Martin Luther King and all of the other figures associated with the Black church who were so deeply involved in civil rights organization and protest. And probably some of you have read, or at least been assigned, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail at some point in your academic career. If you go back and read that letter and think of it in light of this landscape I'm describing, I think it actually illustrates this moment of Christian convergence, because here he is, an African-American pastor and activist, and he's very clearly speaking to an audience of not just Americans, not just white Americans, but fellow white American Christians. And he's, bringing in Thomas Aquinas, sort of pulling in figures from different American Christian traditions, or not just American, obviously, sort of historical Christian traditions, to make the case for civil rights in language that made particular sense at this moment, where evangelical, Catholic, and Protestant sort of ideas were all intersecting at the center of American life. In certain ways, you could only imagine the civil rights movement playing out the way it did in this landscape of strong Christian churches, strong religious identity, and a strong convergence rather than just enmity between the different branches of American Christianity. So that's sort of the old world. And, now it's quite distant from us, several generations distant. But that's the world whose crack up, whose sort of demise yielded the religious landscape that we have now. Because starting you can measure it at different points, but starting somewhere in the 1960s, that long story of American history, where over time churches grow, they gain more members, more and more Americans identify with some denomination, some piece of Christianity, that story comes to an end. And you get a period of the beginnings of a period that has continued in fits and starts to the present day, where institutional Christianity is in decline. People stop identifying as Methodists, as Presbyterians, as Catholics. Church-going falls, but identification falls faster, more profoundly. So the churches lose the kind of marginal members, the Christmas and Easter Christians or Catholics. But in many ways, I think you could say that sort of those marginal members are actually the sign, the indicator of how influential a church really is, right? How much does it influence people who aren't necessarily in the pews every Sunday? So, it's sort of cold comfort to say, oh, you're only losing your marginal members if your marginal members are the very expression of your influence over society. So institutional Christianity goes into decline. Why? Well, many, many reasons, but I'm going to offer you 4 that I think are useful for framing our own moment, because all of them in different ways still apply in our own moment, right? So what changes in the 1960s? Well, we'll start with money. America, post-war America, has a sort of surge of religious identification, but the bigger surge that it has is a surge of wealth. No society before in recorded history had ever been as rich as America after World War II. And it was sort of wealth on a scale unimaginable in human history. Obviously, it's imaginable to us because we sort of live in that world, but it was a surge of growth that, I've mentioned suburbanization, but it just made American society more mobile. Sort of people became more and more able to sort of leave behind communities, ethnic communities, religious communities, any kind of community if they felt like it. It made it easier for people to get divorced, right? A society that's wealthier is a society where it's easier for people to live on their own, to leave unhappy marriages, to leave semi-happy marriages. And generally, it's sort of a truism that, that as societies become richer, they become somewhat less religious. And it's not through any sort of conscious act of your intellect that you're suddenly deciding I'm gonna serve money or mammon rather than God. It's just, I think, a fairly inevitable correlation that religion is more appealing, more naturally appealing, more interesting to people, sort of more immediately important to people when they're living closer to the edge of existence and when they live in greater comfort. And this is obviously one of the persistent themes of the New Testament, but it runs through many religious traditions besides Christianity. As you live in greater comfort, you're less likely to think about uncomfortable things like your ultimate death, which in your ultimate death is a very important force in focusing attention on arguments and ideas around religion. So America gets richer and it becomes less religious. So that's money. Then alongside money, you have sex. America in the 1960s enters what we call the sexual revolution that starts, depending on how you want to analyze it, with Hugh Hefner founding Playboy, or with the invention of the birth control pill. Wherever Philip Larkin has this great poem where he says, sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me. It's just a poetic digression, but something did change around 1963, right? And what changed above all was the end of a kind of easy compatibility or natural compatibility between, what you would call for Christians, New Testament sexual ethics, but really sort of all of Western monotheism's sexual ethics and normal middle-class American life. So it's not that prior to 1963, everyone, was a virgin until they got married and nobody ever got divorced and everybody was perfectly chaste along the lines prescribed by traditional Christianity. But it was the case that people thought of the idea of, chastity before marriage, staying married, not getting divorced, obviously everything around sort of homosexuality and so on was sort of considered off the table culturally. All of those ideas seem to fit with people's sense of what, a sort of normal, careful, reasonable, respectable life was like. So even if they weren't the most zealously religious, the fact that the Christian churches had these sexual teachings, it seemed to fit generally with how people expected themselves and their kids to live out their own lives. And that changes in the 60s, and it has never really changed back, right? From then on, they're sort of, with the divorce revolution, with, the general rise, not so much in premarital sex, but in the number of sexual partners that people have before marriage, in the amount of time that's spent between teenage life and when people actually get married. Out of all of those changes, long before same-sex marriage or anything else comes along as an issue, you have sort of two new ways of looking at sort of religion's traditional sexual teachings. One is that they're totally unrealistic. They're nice, but let's not be naive, right? Nobody's actually going to save sex for marriage. You can't really expect more than 50% of marriages to last a lifetime and so on. That's, it's an ideal, but it's naive, right? That's one way of looking at it. The other way is that it's bad, right? These are toxic ideas. They're patriarchal ideas. They're misogynistic ideas. They're ideas that control people, control women, especially. Again, once debates about homosexuality come around, they're heteronormative ideas. So the idea is that traditional religious teachings are oppressive around sex. That becomes a very powerful idea in a way that, existed before the 60s, but was more marginal. And the Christian churches, religion in general, that, the churches don't exactly know how to respond to it, right? And there's sort of two big ways to respond. One is to sort of adapt by basically saying, well, these teachings need to change. We need to update, we need to become progressive, we need to become a little more permissive, we need to accept the sexual revolution. And the other way is to sort of bunker down and say, we're condemning these changes, we're reiterating the traditional teachings. And neither of those models seems to yield, really obvious cultural success. The first model is more appealing to a lot of people, but it doesn't actually keep people in the pews. It creates this sense that, actually Christianity doesn't really mean what it says, right? You're just sort of ignoring all these Bible passages because they're no longer convenient. So, we're glad you made the change, but we're not really taking your religion seriously, right? That seems to be a common cultural response to sort of liberalized forms of Christianity. But then the more conservative forms of Christianity, they can sort of build a kind of resilient culture inside a cultural bunker, but they have a really hard time getting beyond that bunker and sort of convincing people who are a little bit outside it that they aren't just either out of touch or antiquated or, again, sort of toxic and misogynistic and destructive. So neither the liberal nor the conservative response generates a clear way to sort of sustain the Christian church's then dominant position in the culture. So money happens, sex happens, then you could say sort of communications technology happens, right? That, you have a revolution through radio and then television, especially long before the internet, but then the internet has its own effect in just sort of how people experience the world changes dramatically. The world in all its dizzying diversity is suddenly beamed into people's homes, into their living rooms. You're not just sort of operating within your own community where you're either going to be a Presbyterian or you're going to be a Catholic or you're going to be a Baptist, or there's one weirdo who doesn't go to church, right? Your community is the whole world, right? And again, this is more true now, but it started to really be true with television before iPhones and everything else, right? And so you look at that kind of scope and scale of things, and it's not that it makes people stop believing in God. It makes them stop believing that their parents' first congregational church on the green could possibly have any kind of monopoly on spiritual and theological wisdom. And it makes it much easier for people to be, again, not unbelievers, but moral and theological relativists, to say, look, the way to go through life is to take something from the Christian tradition and something from the Buddhist tradition and something from this and something from that, and put it together in a way that works for you, because you can assume that anyone who says they have an exclusive truth or a near exclusive truth is trying to put one over on you, because the world is just too diverse and complex for that to be true. So that becomes a powerful force that the internet clearly accelerates in driving disaffiliation from institutional religion. And then finally, you have politics and political polarization. So one of the notable things about mid-century America is that the political parties at that time are not actually sorted by ideology. And this is a weird thing to think about in our own time, where it's just sort of, it's like, the Republicans are the conservatives and the Democrats are the liberals and the moderates are somewhere in between, right? But the parties are sort of coherent coalitions of people who share intense beliefs. 1955, that's not really true. The parties are much looser, sort of regional, there are actually political scientists who write articles and books saying it's this big problem in mid-century America that, if you vote for one party or the other, you can't be sure what you're going to get. We need more polarization, right? That was a view 50 or 60 years ago. You have conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats. You have conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans, right? It's just a very different landscape. And in that landscape, religious figures, while they, are seen as political in certain ways, Martin Luther King is seen as more liberal, Billy Graham would be seen as more conservative, they aren't seen through a partisan lens in nearly the same way that almost every public figure in our own life who does anything that even touches on moral debates and so on is seen as a partisan first and, a Christian or a religious leader second, right? You don't have, you have religious conservatives and religious liberals, but you don't have anything like what became the religious right. And, you don't have the dynamics. The civil rights movement is this sort of big political crusade that has intense religious support. But it's sort of unique in that way. It's not, it's not a model where your local church, if it's sort of a liberal Protestant church, is going to have a checklist of, we have this position on environmental issues and this position on racial justice issues and this position on transgender rights issues and so on, right? There's just less of that kind of polarization. And what happens as the two parties polarize, as conservatives all move into the Republican coalition and liberals all move into the Democratic coalition, is it just becomes harder and harder for any institution or any leader to find a place to stand where they aren't branded as a conservative first and a Christian second, or a liberal first and a Christian second. And indeed, you can see this just in data on people being asked, would you be upset if your son and daughter married X? So go back 70 years, and in spite of the convergence I was talking about, it was still the case that people wanted their kids to marry inside their own religious tradition. If you were a Catholic, you wanted your kid to marry a Catholic. If you were a Baptist, you wanted your kid to marry a Baptist. Nowadays, there's much less of that, but people are more likely to say, I don't want my kid marrying a Democrat. I'm not going to have my kid marry a Republican. Which says something, I think, really important about how political identity has just become much more important than almost any other kind of identity, but certainly than religious identity. And in that landscape, you get a phenomenon where people disaffiliate from religion as a political statement, right? So this happens in certain ways first to more liberal churches. If you look at the 1960s and 1970s, the churches that are seen as politically liberal, mostly mainline Protestant churches, they lose some people who are just say, well, you know, if the church is just about liberal politics, why do I need to, you know, get up on Sunday morning and say a creed I don't really believe in when I can just donate to the Sierra Club instead, right? That sort of is one force that empties people out. And then the other force is people who say, well, I don't agree with these causes, so I'm going to leave and go to the more conservative evangelical church over there, right? So this hollows out liberal Christianity. But then starting in the 1990s, as the religious right sort of develops as a political force, you see a similar kind of thing, but in reverse. You see people who used to identify with even evangelical traditions saying, well, I don't agree with George W. Bush, or I don't like Sarah Palin, or I hate Donald Trump. And I associate conservative Christianity with those people. And so I'm going to cease to identify with Christianity because I am not a Republican, right? So you get this sort of disaffiliation from Christianity driven by polarization. And so out of those four forces, all of which are very much with us today, you just get the steady weakening of loyalty to institutional churches. And obviously there's a lot of things I haven't, you know, a lot of other forces in play. I haven't touched on the sex abuse crisis within Catholicism. There's a general crisis of American institutions, a crisis of trust in American institutions. The churches are not alone in having this kind of experience. But I think those big four forces go a long way to explaining how you get a landscape where, you know, after a 200-year history where joining a church was sort of a really normal central aspect of American identity, in today's landscape, especially for people younger than myself, especially for people who are this age of college students today, you have just the least churched version of America that we've had, you know, since the 19th century, maybe. And since the sort of upper reaches of American sort of academic life and cultural life are extremely non-religious, you know, the typical academic at Yale Law School is probably not a practicing Christian, right? That's a fairly safe bet. In general, that just means I think we can say institutional religion, institutional Christianity is weak in American life as never before. So what then is our actual landscape, having rambled a bit telling that story? Is it a landscape, you know, the title of this talk mentioned a secular age, right? Is it a secular landscape? You know, in certain ways, yes. If the institutional forms of religion are weaker, then religion itself is in some way weaker. It makes sense in certain ways to talk about a process of secularization playing out in American life, but that can be overstated because in many ways, American culture remains deeply oriented towards spirituality and spiritual exploration. It's just less and less likely for that exploration and that interest to take any kind of sort of conventional institutional form. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. I think you can see sort of two broad movements in American culture that manifest that sort of persistence. The first is, Bob mentioned that I wrote a book called How We Became a Nation of Heretics. The idea in that book was that there was a really important stream within American religion that was reasonably described as heretical Christianity, a form of religion that was still deeply influenced by Christian ideas, but that had sort of departed in various dramatic ways from what you would call sort of traditional orthodoxy, whether it was Protestant or Catholic and so on, right? And this kind of religion is a kind of, you could call it a kind of Christianity of self-help, right? Where the idea is there obviously is a God, maybe Jesus Christ is an important, embodiment of God sent to earth to help us lead good lives, maybe help us get us to heaven. But the most important aspect of religion is helping you in your everyday life, right? In this modern American landscape where we're rich and sexually liberated and, have sort of the world before us to sort of act in, as very few human beings have, a level of freedom that's sort of unique in human history. And in this world, God is your life coach, right? God is there, there are different forms of this. There's sort of an overt kind of prosperity gospel form where God is there to like help you get rich, or just help you get to the upper middle class, not even to get rich, right? Like just to sort of help you figure out how to manage money. If you're an immigrant, help you assimilate to the American middle class, help you get a nice house in the suburbs. And so a figure like, someone like Joel Osteen, right, who's sort of in certain ways an equivalent figure to Billy Graham, a really successful Christian pastor who writes books with titles like Your Best Life Now, right? That's one form of this kind of self-help spirituality. And some of the people who are into it do go to church. Osteen obviously has a big and successful megachurch, but it's not a confessional Christianity. It's not interested in creeds and theological debates. And it's also not interested in, the sort of the hard teachings of Christianity, the whole take up your cross and follow me stuff. Billy Graham would, the way to think about the shift is that Billy Graham would host a, huge rally and say, God loves you absolutely and wants you to give your life to him so you won't go to hell. And Joel Osteen just says, God loves you absolutely and wants you to be happy. That's sort of a way to understand the shift, right? And Osteen and others more explicitly are more focused on sort of material existence, but then there's a version of this that's more therapeutic, right? It's for people who are doing pretty well, who aren't as worried about God helping them make the mortgage payment or buy the boat, but are sort of personally unhappy, right? And so God is there as your kind of therapist, right? To sort of help you, help you navigate, figure out your childhood trauma, help you, sort of navigate your personal relationships, and help you to be sort of personally fulfilled. So, you could probably say that someone like Oprah is a little closer to this than Osteen is, although they overlap. But there was a book, it's a bit antiquated now, but it was a huge bestseller about 15 years ago called Eat, Pray, Love, that maybe some of you have heard of. Maybe I'm not totally an antique now in referencing it. But it was, if you were to pick one book to understand this kind of shift in American spirituality, it would be that book, right? And the author, Elizabeth Gilbert, is a successful journalist who is very unhappy in her marriage. And she decides she's going to leave her marriage and go on a kind of quest. And the first stop, the eating part, is in Italy and Rome. And then there's the praying part, which is in Asia and in India at an ashram. And then there's the love part, which is falling in love with a handsome Brazilian divorcee in Bali, right? And the thing to say about this kind of book is that it is entirely in earnest as a spiritual quest. There's not an ounce of cynicism in the book. The book is fascinated not just by like the idea of God out there, but of spiritual experience. But she doesn't go to Rome for the spiritual experience. You don't go to Christianity for the spiritual experience. You need somewhere more exotic, right? So you go to India, but she has spiritual experiences in the ashram that would be familiar from any sort of mystic's account from, from medieval traditions, right? This is a very modern woman having a very ancient kind of mystical encounter. But the point of the mystical encounter is not that you then convert to some existing religion or embed yourself in some existing tradition. It is that it then frees you to find your personal happiness and go on with your life as before, right? So that, I think, is sort of the essence of the kind of therapeutic self-help spirituality. And it is, in Gilbert's case, it's not Christian, but it still is, it's sort of operating within kind of semi-Christian worldview. In other cases, it's sort of closer to Christianity. It still is connected in some way to sort of to Christian traditions and Christian beliefs, I think. And there's also this desire in this version too, to always sort of repurpose Jesus, right? So around the same time that Gilbert's book was a huge success, the huge sort of thriller bestseller was Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which again, some of you have probably seen 5 minutes of the movie with Tom Hanks or something, right? But this was no book outsold the Da Vinci Code 15 years ago. And the point of the Da Vinci Code is that, you know, Jesus, the Catholic Church has been covering up the truth about Jesus. Jesus was actually married. He actually worshiped the sacred feminine. He was a pretty cool guy, not the uptight jerk you might have heard about in Sunday school, right? And the whole idea was to keep Jesus and get rid of the parts of Christianity that we consider backward and out of date. And there was, you know, a whole sort of academic correlative of this, of sort of pseudo-serious biblical scholars claiming that they had read the New Testament, and it turned out that Jesus, you know, Jesus was like a 1970s kind of guy. And then the church came along and, you know, and wanted to repress everybody. But Jesus himself was, you know, a kind of wandering teacher, a purveyor of therapeutic nostrums, right? This was a very powerful idea. And it reflected, again, I think, this desire to keep some part of Christianity while moving beyond the aspects that seemed out of date. So that's one sort of form of persistence of spirituality amid institutional decline. The other one has become, I think, more important in the last 10 or 15 years, which is a more sort of overtly post-Christian, and you might call it pagan, you might call it magic-oriented form of spirituality, that is sort of more explicitly supernaturalist in its emphasis. It's a little bit unclear how much full belief there is. You know, one of the big shifts since I was your age, to speak to the younger people in the room, is around sort of popular belief in astrology. So astrology was really big when my parents were, I guess, your age, right, in the 70s. And, you know, when I was a little kid, I watched my parents' friends, and people knew each other's sign, right? They'd be like, oh, you know, you're a Sagittarius, you're a Virgo, right? That all just disappears completely for about 20 or 25 years. When I was in college, if you introduced yourself to someone and they said, oh, yeah, well, I'm in a bad mood because I'm a Virgo and, you know, Capricorn is under whatever, I'm not even going to get it right. I'm sure some of you could, right? People would look at you like you had literally like farted in, well, not in church, but, you know, farted in the dorm room, right? But then astrology has, as many of you know, made a comeback as a kind of cultural force with a lot of ambiguity about how fully people believe in it, right? Like at least when I talk to Generation Z people, it's like, well, you know, astrology, do you really believe that the planets are influencing your destiny? It's like, you sort of believe, you sort of don't, you're sort of playing around with it. It's kind of fun to play around with, right? Like there's a lot of that sort of like hipster paganism, you could say, as a force in American life lately. But then there's also sort of more overt, like if you go into the Barnes and Noble in Southern Connecticut, right? Like there are, again, relative to 10 years ago, many more shelves of books in the religion and spirituality section that are just like witchcraft. Here's how you do it, right? Spells and incantations, you know, here's how you do magic and so forth, right? As sort of a kind of spirituality that's very overtly about trying to reach out to spiritual powers that are not the sort of Christian God way above everything, but are, you know, some sort of intermediate level that you're asking for intervention in your life. And you can see this in terms of sort of people's avowed beliefs. There are now more, by some measurements, there are now more people who call themselves Wiccans in American society than there are Presbyterians, which would have surprised people in 1955 if you'd told them that was where America is going. Now, it doesn't mean that, you know, these are still in certain ways marginal forces, but they also, I think, overlap with some of the sort of particular interests of our own moment right now, right? So there's, for instance, a lot of interest in mind-altering hallucinogenic drugs, right? Again, relative to 15 or 20 years ago, which are seen by a lot of their users as sort of spiritual doorway openers. And, you know, this varies with the drug, but there's a lot of sort of, again, there's sort of ambiguity here, but there's a lot of people who take these drugs as a means to access what they feel are real spiritual dimensions and have real spiritual encounters with peculiar beings sometimes, right? And in parallel to this, there's a revival driven in part by videos that the Pentagon releases, but a revival in interest in UFOs and alien life and extraterrestrial life. And yes, that's science fiction and not religion, but in another way, it has a strong religious element, right? I know people, especially in places like the Bay Area, who will say, oh yeah, I have a friend who thinks that she's in touch with, extraterrestrials who are communicating with her in order to bring enlightenment to Earth, right? And these ideas, again, some of them were sort of present in American life in the 1970s, but they have more of a sort of free field to operate in now, as again, sort of institutional Christianity has gotten weaker and weaker. And it remains to be seen how the sort of emergence of artificial intelligence and people's sort of fascination with the idea that we're sort of summoning non-human intelligences on our computer screens, how that plays into it. But however you describe it, I think there's clearly been a turn in the last 10 or 15 years towards a kind of a quest for helpful powers that you can appeal to, whether it's through astrology or through witchcraft or through just sort of trying to get in touch with the spirits of your ancestors, going to seances. All of these things, again, have history in American life before now, including in Western New York State, right? You can go, there's a village, what's it called? Is it on Lake Ontario? Anyway, there's a village that was founded by spiritualists in the late 19th century. That's probably a couple hours drive from here, where all the psychics gather every year. So these things are not entirely new, but the combination of their revival and the weakness of institutional churches has created, I think, a really distinctive spiritual landscape in America right now, where you have sort of the continued presence and strong influence of sort of church-based religion that has obviously not gone away at all. You have sort of this zone of therapeutic self-help spirituality, and then you have people who are, either in a non-literal or a very literal way, trying to wake up Jupiter from his slumber and ask him or, some other pre-Christian god for help. And some of that last element too is influenced by the strong interest on the political left in kind of indigenous forms of spirituality, right? Which has become, again, there's this persistent ambiguity, right? When, a kind of progressive group stands up and says, we want to center indigenous ways of knowing against sort of white Western medicine. Do they literally mean that we want, we think that sort of the supernatural elements in an indigenous native tribe's beliefs are literally true, or are they making a political statement? And the answer is somewhere in between, I think. But even that somewhere in between, I think, is an interesting religious development. So that's sort of an account, I think, of roughly where we are. And I've gone on for about 40 or 45 minutes, but let me just say two last things. First, a set of, sort of two slightly distinct things. The first thing is that, there is a narrative, there's a way of talking about all of this that sort of, assumes, that basically looks at this and says, well, this is proof of humanity's persistent irrationality, right? And you get a lot of commentary like this, I think, especially in the last 10 years, because you had this sort of period 10 or 15 years ago where there was a big vogue for the so-called new atheism, right? Figures like Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, who would just sort of launch these scathing attacks on organized religion. You couldn't turn on the television for a little while without seeing Hitchens, having his way with some bumbling bishop in some public debate. It was just sort of, it was a rough time for the forces of religion. And I think there were a lot of people who were around for that, who watched that happen and said, oh, man, we've really taken care of religion, and then have been sort of surprised in all the ways it has sort of remained resilient, or have been sort of horrified and appalled, right, by some of its manifestations, right? And so you'll hear from some people today who will say, you know, I was really against institutional Christianity 20 years ago, but seeing that as institutional Christianity weakens, people turn to like tarot cards and seances, I guess maybe institutional Christianity wasn't so bad because people need religion. You know, we're never going to escape religion, even if it's irrational. And as a religious person myself, I think that's, you know, notwithstanding the successes of Christopher Hitchens as a public debater, I think that view is basically all wrong, and that the resilience of religion is owed, in fact, to the persistent rationality of belief. And some of that rationality reflects the extent to which the sort of persistent and inevitable limits of the sort of the aspect of the scientific project that tries to reduce all of human existence to purely material causes. Because I think in our own era, in a lot of different ways, we're clearly bumping up against the limits of that project. Like you see this in sort of cosmology and physics, where science learns more and more and more about the structure and order of the universe. And man, the universe continues to look extremely orderly and extremely structured and almost designed. And, you know, these, you know, precise mathematical laws, which turn out to be so precisely calibrated, as if the universe intended for human life to emerge. And the only way out of that, if you don't want to believe in God, is to say, well, I guess we're one of an infinite number of universes, which you can witness by, you know, turning on Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, or watching Everything Everywhere All at Once, and see, you know, there's no God. It's just, you know, our universe seems to have been designed because there are actually 1 trillion universes, and it's just random that we're in this one. I think that isn't a very satisfying account. And it's not clear to me why positing an infinity of universes is more credible in any way than positing a single creative God. And at the very least, I think religion sort of comes out even in that particular narrative. And similarly with the study of the mind and consciousness, this idea that, you know, we're going to reduce and reduce and reduce, and we'll finally sort of put paid to the soul once and for all, and we'll figure out that it's all just chemical reactions happening in the brain. But in fact, we've reduced and reduced and reduced without coming up with a particularly compelling explanation for how all those fascinating chemical reactions in the brain actually yield the extremely strange experience of conscious selfhood. And that's why if you look at the artificial intelligence project right now, it's actually kind of upfront about saying, we don't know we don't know how consciousness works. We don't know how to create it. We're just going to make these computer programs more and more and more and more complex. And we're going to assume that at some point magic happens and consciousness emerges from the machine. And maybe it will, but if it does, we still won't understand why it has actually happened. So in those places and other areas besides, I think that the original intellectual argument for religion, that it was a plausible way to make sense of both the design and order of the cosmos and our own mind's peculiar place within it, still makes as much sense, certainly, as it did in 1955, probably even as much as it did in 1555 or 55 AD. So that's one reason, for sort of rational reason, for religion's resilience. And the other one, I guess I'll just end here and we can save the sort of questions of what happens next for the Q&A. But the other aspect is just, I mentioned, you know, sort of personal spiritual questing as an aspect of our time. Religious experience doesn't go away. You can, you know, decide arbitrarily that, you know, we can just assume that religious experiences are all just events in the brain, and, you know, ghostly visitations are just, you know, you have a bad night's sleep in a place that's supposed to be haunted and all these things. But the reality is that even in a society that is as officially secular as ours is, people just keep having religious experiences. And they have more of them the more they go hunting for them. If you decide you really want to have a religious experience, you probably can find a way to have it. including under some conditions that I really wouldn't recommend. But even if you don't, even if you are just a secular person living your life in a material world, there's a good chance that something weird is going to happen to you, and you're going to have a sort of unbidden encounter with what feels like ultimate reality. And independent of questions of rationality, that alone is sort of enough to keep religion going in some form, no matter how officially secular society becomes. But even from the point of view of sort of the reasonable perspective on the nature of human existence, when you tack on the persistence of spiritual experience to the persistent order of the cosmos and the persistent mysteries of the human mind, I think you have a continued rational case for the relevance of taking questions about God and ultimate meaning just as seriously as people did back several generations ago when the churches were much stronger than they were today. So I'll end on that note. And I intended to say something about the future, but hopefully someone will ask a question about the future, and it's better to pivot to Q&A now. So thank you all so much for listening.
Or now open for questions, and I'd like to bring the microphone around to you because sometimes we can't hear the questions. So let's begin with 3 or 4 student questions, and yeah, open it up to anything that he has said, any provocative statements and observations and insights. So who will be the first brave soul to challenge? And
it's also okay to say, I agree with everything you said. You're a genius.
Try to formulate your comment in the form of a question rather than a statement or a declaration, but yeah, so I'm giving you the mic and I'm trusting you that you're not going to run away with it.
You specifically talked about the loss of legitimacy within liberal churches and the loss of influence of the churches that bunker down and go into a more conservative sects. Is there any possible way in which a church organization could essentially adapt yet not lose its influence while still maintaining to Christian fundamental teachings, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. That's a very good question. I think the short answer is that there certainly may be, but we do not have a clear model in the post-1960s, and we can say not just America, but the developed world, of what exactly that would look like. A church that seems deeply connected to its own teachings and is also profoundly influential, sort of outside a kind of particular cultural zone, right? The models of sort of religious resilience in the Western world tend to either just be sort of kind of culturally distinct, so not sort of Catholicism writ large, but a kind of conservative subculture within Catholicism, right? Or with evangelicalism, a sort of, I mean, this was probably more true 15 years ago than today, but there was a very distinctive evangelical subculture that developed to sort of protect evangelical life from the secularizing forces that I tried to describe, right? And so but it also sort of imitated secular culture in various ways, right? So it's like, you can stay in evangelicalism because we've got Christian rock, you don't need the secular rock and roll and so on, right? And that still exists. It's sort of come under strain in various ways, but it existed as a really self-conscious subculture, right? Lots and lots of people listen to Christian rock, but not a lot of non-Christians listen to Christian rock, right? And you didn't have, there were figures like, Rick Warren, who famously, was this, very successful evangelical Protestant pastor who was a big enough deal that he could be invited somewhat controversially to give a benediction at Barack Obama's inauguration, right? Like, there were some models, figures who were a little more like Billy Graham and sort of getting a little bit outside partisan categories. But the last 10 years have been tough on that model too, right? And then you have models like the Mormons, which, are sort of its own thing in certain ways, but you can look at, sort of Utah and Southern Idaho, right, as its own kind of sort of resilient bunker against some of the forces I've described. But in spite of all of the Mormon Latter-day Saint sort of very admirable missionary work, Mormon culture is not particularly influential beyond that zone, right? So there just isn't a sort of distinctive model. And if you look at Catholicism, the first couple years of Pope Francis's pontificate, right, were this period where it seemed like, you had a pope who could be a kind of secular media celebrity, who could make a certain number of liberalizing gestures, but also be seen as sort of retaining sort of connections sort of to the sort of traditions of Catholicism. But that model, broke down very quickly, and you ended up with a kind of simmering Catholic civil war that's been going on to the present. And lots of secular people still like Pope Francis, but you wouldn't say he's sort of a defining religious personality outside the Catholic Church. He struggles to impose even within the Catholic Church. So anyway, that's sort of a list of examples that indicate why it's such a challenging problem, right? And I think to the extent that you can find case studies, they're usually they're sort of micro rather than macro. Tim Keller, who some of you may have heard of, famous Presbyterian writer and pastor, had a lot of success planting churches in pretty secular and liberal environments, in spite of himself being a fairly theologically conservative Presbyterian. So there were sort of, it was called Redeemer Presbyterian, his church. It still exists in New York, and it has sort of models around the country, getting sort of people who are in sort of secular worlds, who are interested in religion, to come in, sort of sometimes de-emphasizing sort of difficult teachings around sex especially, but not jettisoning them. But that's, again, is a sort of narrow model that you can say, well, this church is doing it, right? But it's not a macro model that has sort of national influence. So I think probably you have to go further away from the old world of Christianity. Like you have to have sort of more breakdown before you can imagine sort of a kind of, a rebuilt sort of successful orthodoxy. And it may be that, the sort of drift towards paganism and magic and so on is actually a necessary precondition. Like that society has to go a certain distance away from sort of the old time religion before the old time religion could possibly be appealing. Because for now, you have a lot of people who are just like, I know what Christianity is, and, it's my parents' religion, and it's not for me, but I know enough. I think I know enough about it that I don't need to even take it seriously. So yeah, it may be that Christianity needs to become more exotic to become interesting again to a certain kind of American.
Another student question? No, I'd like you to use the microphone.
So that the internet can hear you.
So to touch on your conversation on the macro model, do you think that there will be a strategic push from churches like in the pure hope to keep doors open? Like when you're looking in the future to 2025, do you think that you will see a push of churches becoming like localized, more like community center, pushing away from teaching and more towards the personality of the people involved? Like how do you, from your view, see churches strategically trying to gain membership, especially for young people? Like when you see the people in this room start to think about joining a religious organization and making the financial commitment to do so, like how do you foresee them winning over Gen Z? I think it's another big answer to that question.
Well, just to advertise my own Catholic tradition, I promise there's no financial commitment involved. You just sit in the back pew, fumble with your rosary beads, put $1 in the plate, you'll fit right in. Sorry. So one, there is already, right, I think, a sort of pretty successful model of kind of non-denominational Christianity, right, which is the part of American Christianity that sort of held up most successfully. that, and maybe it is a partial answer to your question, because it does tend to be a little more theologically conservative if you like actually ask someone what their theology is, right? But nobody says what the key is. You don't say what the theology is, and so people don't stress it too much, right? And the idea of like what gets called seeker sensitive Christianity, which is basically somewhat a version of that model, right? That, you're creating a church as a space of community in, a suburban or exurban landscape, especially where people don't have, they don't have like a walkable neighborhood. They need a place to come together on Sunday. It happens to be a Christian church. There's a little bit of theology, but not too much. And yeah, that model, I think, has a fair amount of success sort of in American life already. And you could certainly imagine, I think, a world where, what we are living through in America right now is sort of a continued atomization of social life that is, that has been accelerated by a lot of forces. COVID accelerated it. The internet has accelerated it, right? But more and more people, fewer and fewer people are getting married. Fewer and fewer people are having kids. Family size is shrinking. There's just sort of generally more personal isolation through the life cycle. And as with all trends, it seems like that can only go so far before people are going to sort of gravitate back towards forms of community independent of their particular religious and spiritual beliefs. And I think you would expect, that sort of churches that think of themselves in sort of, as offering community to that kind of population, that sort of have a kind of communitarian vision of what they're doing, would have a certain kind of success. I do think, though, that then there are also the other forces I've described impose some limits on that success, right? Because as long as sort of culture war debates divide Americans, as long as political polarization divides Americans, at a certain point, your seeker-sensitive church is going to get successful enough that people are going to come to you and say, "Hey, what do you, Donald Trump? What's your take on Donald Trump?" And that's when you're in trouble, right? And then the secondary issue, right, is intergenerational transmission, where traditional confessional forms of Christianity were set up with the idea that you gave your kids a deep catechesis in what it meant to be a Presbyterian or a Catholic or anything else, right? And that was crucial to keeping them involved in the church. And that continues to be true, that churches that do that, or I shouldn't say churches, I should really just say parents who do that are more likely to have their kids practice the same religion as the parents, right? And it's not clear to me how well the kind of seeker-sensitive model of religion translates to that. Like, the danger with the seeker-sensitive model is, you pull in people move to a suburb, they have kids, like, we should go to church. They go to this church, it's a good communal experience, but then their kid goes off to college and is just like, has a sort of vague religious identity. And then the whole process has to start over again when that kid turns 35 or something, right? And that kid, so that's sort of at some point, I think, to be really culturally influential, the seeker-sensitive model has to deal with the political and culture war issues and has to figure out what it's trying to transmit in order to, get beyond sort of where it is today.
Okay, we have another student question, and we'll open it up to faculty and other people.
I was wondering, like, for people who identify as secular, how do you think the environment and drugs can like further their religious experience?
Do you mean the environment like environmentalism, or environment like what? Yeah, so I didn't talk about environmentalism particularly, but that's a really good point to raise, right? Because there's sort of several different ways in which a sort of consciousness of the earth as an ecosystem, I think, plays some role in sort of filling, several different things. It can be a source of religious and spiritual inspiration, right? And again, this is a very American thing. It goes back to, Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, you know, the transcendentalists in the 19th century, but the idea that you encounter God through nature, and that maybe that's a better way to encounter God than going to church and listening to a sermon. That's an old American idea, and environmentalism has given a certain new life to that, right? So there are a lot of people for whom sort of the natural world is itself just a source of spiritual experience in an immediate way. And then the work of preserving the natural world and, you know, issues around climate change especially, but also everything connected to conservation and so on, then becomes a kind of moral work that sort of is similar to the kind of moral work that churches ask you to carry out. And you can sort of draw the comparison even finer and say, you know, when people are buying carbon offsets there, it's the equivalent of someone getting an indulgence in, you know, 15th century Europe or something, right? And there are clearly, I think, some forms of overlap there. And then there's also an overlap in the sort of apocalyptic side, right? Like, you know, one of the things that religion tends to talk about a fair amount is, you know, the end of the world and the wrath of God upon a sinful humanity. And the sort of darkest narrative around climate change has some clear similarities to that we have sinned greatly against the earth, and perhaps the hour is too late and we will be justly punished. And all we can do is sort of prepare to, you know, accept punishment, you know, or ideally work even harder to prevent it, right? So I think, yeah, in all of those different ways and more, I'm just skimming the surface, environmentalism has some kind of religious role. I think that a challenge around it, right, is, you know, maybe a little bit similar to the challenge of seeker-sensitive religion, right, which is that, you know, there's a question, though, of sort of, you know, what, maybe it's a little different, but right, but like nature's kind of a cruel God, right? Like, you know, this experience of awe and amazement and wonder and transcendence through nature is real and profound. But so is the fact that, you know, nature will kill you, you know, very quickly if you wander too deeply into its holiest places. And when you combine that with sort of a sense of impending ecological catastrophe, I think there's a temptation there towards sort of pessimism and despair, right? It's like nature doesn't present a kind of, you know, sort of, it presents a kind of transcendent experience, but it doesn't necessarily present one that cares about you in particular. And then if we've sinned against this transcendent force and it's, you know, and our society is going to collapse because of it, then where is the hope, right? And I think that's what you see in a certain kind of like eco-doomer narrative, is this kind of religious sentiment yielding to a kind of spiritual despair, where, you know, even the people who say I'm not going to have kids because of climate change, right? I'm never sure how fully real that is when people say that, or if it's just sort of like, well, I'm not ready to have kids yet, so I need a kind of moral narrative. But I have known and talked to a lot of people for whom that seems to be a sincere sentiment. And it's a kind of despairing sentiment, I think, that is, you know, born out of this sense of sort of a nature that is beautiful but uncaring and now is going to justly destroy us. That's a somewhat dark, it's a somewhat religious vision, but also a potentially dark one. With drugs, I talked a little bit about it. I mean, I think there is, as you know, as I said, this sort of uncertainty about when people take hallucinogenic drugs, are they doing a kind of therapeutic form of religion where it's like you're inducing spiritual experiences in order to make yourself feel better, right? Get over some kind of trauma, feel more integrated in your daily lives. Or are you doing it as a, like, this is a gateway to another realm where I will encounter an angel, right? And I think people are doing both, and there's sort of an overlap between them. I don't know how weird you want to get, but, you know, I've done a lot of reading about DMT, which is sort of, how many people have heard of DMT? Okay, see, yeah. All right, so DMT, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, is one of the active ingredients in ayahuasca, which is a hallucinogenic drug associated with shamanic rituals, particularly in Latin America and the Amazon, I think. And again, this is sort of used in traditional ingestion of hallucinogens, but America, God bless America, we just take the active ingredient out and people don't need a shaman, you just take the DMT. And what's interesting about DMT, so my understanding, I don't speak from personal experience, but my understanding is that with a lot of hallucinogenic drugs, you take the drug and you're like, whoa, that was a crazy trip. But it was obviously a trip, right? It was a drug-induced trip. That was not reality. When you take DMT, you come back and you're like, wow, that was more real than reality. That was like, you know, the court of the fairy king and queen. That was the astral plane, and I was there. And it's similar in that way to near-death experiences, which also have a similar heightened reality as opposed to unreality. And the other interesting thing about DMT is that people have the same kind of experiences when they take it. They encounter some of the same kinds of beings. So it's not just, so you and I can both take DMT and we'll both come back and I'll be like, did you see those elves who were building that weird machine? And you'll be like, yeah, one of them yelled at me. And I'll be like, oh, they just ignored me, right? But you're seeing similar things. And out of this, people who take DMT are thus more likely, I think, than people who take like LSD to come back and say, yeah, there's a spiritual dimension and you can enter it by like flipping a switch in your brain this way. And there are also, you know, some dark experience. There are people who take DMT for a while and are like, man, every time I went, I met this amazing spirit guide who was like my guardian angel who, you know, taught me about truth and enlightenment. And then on the 8th trip, I realized they were a demon destroying me. Okay. So point is, be careful out there. Let's take another question. Yeah, let's before we all take ayahuasca and
Hi. One of the things that I heard you kind of briefly touch on at the beginning of the speech was sort of this idea that political affiliation is in a lot of ways more important to many folks, sort of than religious affiliation. I was kind of wondering if you think that hyperpartisan politics are the future where people find sort of greater meaning or purpose, or if that party politics have or will become so strongly dogmatic in a lot of ways that they sort of fill the God-sized hole or gap that a lot of people feel in a secular society, sort of away from organized religion.
yeah, I mean, I think it's already happened, right? What you're describing to some real degree. It's very clear. You know, I live among secular liberals primarily, and you know, they're wonderful people, right? You know, they mow their lawns and take care of their kids. But it's very clear among a certain kind of intense secular liberal that politics is just filling the space for religion. It's just, this is your religious identity. You are a good liberal who has a certain set of views. Like, you know, those yard signs, I saw one of them on my way in this house yard sign, we believe this and this and this. I mean, it's just a catechism, right? It's just a statement of beliefs held in faith against, you know, the infidel enemy out there who voted for Donald Trump. And you know, but it has, and then there's clearly a version of this on the right. And on the right, because the right is less secular, you're more likely to have just sort of a conflation of like, I'm, you know, part of my Christian identity is that I supported God's anointed, Donald Trump, right? Like, so it's more sort of the religion is still, overt religion is still there, but there's sort of a religion politics conflation. That's more likely on the right. On the left, it's more just a substitution. This is a generalization, right? There's, and yeah, and both of those run into a version of the problem with sort of environmentalism as religion, right? Which is, you know, sort of the problem of, you know, when you're losing, right? Like God has abandoned you. And if you're, especially among secular liberals, it's like, you know, you have these, secular liberalism has ended up in this place where it has incredibly strong moral commitments and incredibly weak metaphysical beliefs. Like it knows what justice is, absolutely, but it couldn't tell you why that justice in any way corresponds to the order of the universe. Probably is no order of the universe, but we know what justice is. And that, again, is like a recipe for despair. If you know what justice is, but God is dead and the cosmos doesn't care, I mean, that's really depressing, right? Like that, you know, I think there's a lot of arguments about, you know, why are younger Americans more depressed, and why are younger liberals especially more depressed? And I do think a lot of it is the toxic impact of social media and the iPhone and so on. But I think some of it is that dynamic. If you ratchet up moral fervor, but don't provide any guarantee that, like, you know, the arc of history actually bends towards justice, then every loss is just a signifier of like the looming abyss, right? The fascists are just going to take over and there's nothing we can do about it. It's horrible. So yeah, the dynamics on the right are a little bit different. But in both cases, I think you have a clear sort of political identity overwhelming and subsuming religious identity and or substituting for it. How long that lasts, I don't know.
So in schooling of all levels, churches, particularly the Catholic Church, want to maintain their own educational systems. And as the horizon of education in the United States continues to evolve, I'm interested in how you think religious education will either support institutional religion or degrade it in the quiz.
I mean, it can do both, but I think a religious school that is, there's sort of models of religious education that are sort of, punitive and bunker oriented, that keep a certain number of kids in the faith, but, anyone who has any sort of creativity and sort of ambition will end up rejecting them. And then there's a model of religious education that's just sort of empty, like where religion is an empty signifier, which you see in some Catholic schools now. It's like, we're a school in the Catholic tradition, which means we say one Our Father a week and, have, a picture of the Virgin Mary behind a file cabinet in the office of the sub vice principal, right? Like that model is also not keeping anyone religious. So the kind of religious education that you're doing matters a great deal. I think the biggest success that conservative Christianity as like a broad cultural phenomenon has had in the last 10 or 15 years is in sort of a kind of startup approach to secondary education, especially, but also primary education around classical Christian education as sort of these schools that are a kind of counter programming for the more sort of like, we must give you an iPad and teach you technical mastery model of education. How big that movement can get, I don't know. And it can run into the problems of sort of, the kind of like bunker mentality, not sufficiently engaged with the wider world problem, but it has been quite successful. And if you're a conservative Christian who wants to feel optimistic about your own side's cultural dynamism, that's where I'd look. And I'd also just, the other thing to add, right, is that there's this conceit that, kids who are raised religious go to college and lose their faith. Right. And that's why there's so much focus on campus culture wars and, do you have enough conservative professors? Sorry. And, are there any conservative professors? Are all the professors indoctrinating you, turning you into woke leftist automatons or whatever? But the evidence I've seen, the place where kids lose their faith the most is high school. Because that's the period when, if you're a religious kid, but you're in a secular, that's the period when you're most likely to rebel if you're sort of in an intensive religious environment. But alternatively, if you're a religious kid, but going through a secular public school, everything you're being told at that point is that, not that religion is false, but that it's not important, right? And you've got 16 extracurriculars and 5 youth sports and, and that's the zone, you've probably been, if you're in a church that you're confirmed, let's say at 13 or 14, then there's no more sort of religious progression. So in terms of keeping kids religious, that the zone of high school, I think, is a lot more important than people think. And the zone of college, while also important, a lot of kids who drift away from the faith have done 80% of the drifting by the time they're seniors in high school, I think.
Do you see the same pattern in other Western countries and with the variety of religion philosophical views in Eastern states, especially the rise of corporations for adopting and professing like philosophical history?
Repeat the set. He asked about how I see these trends playing out in other Western countries. But then you asked about corporations, which kind of corporations adopting religious and philosophical views? Give me an example.
There's been, I know multiple companies in China that have adopted Confucianism and had that be a more, like more than a company motto, but
Right.
live by that, it's integrating more to their work culture. I know it's not exactly a religion.
No. That's a really interesting example. I mean, the patterns in the wider developed world, you would say first that America is pretty unique among Western countries in the resilience of even the churches themselves and religious practice more generally, right? And we're less unique than 25 years ago, we looked really unique. That we were sort of this big exception to secularization. The sort of subsequent decline that we've experienced has brought us closer to where Western Europe is, but really most of Europe is, I think that secularization is a better term for what's happened in Europe in a way than what's happened in America. Although in Europe too, you have this sort of free floating spirituality. You have, astrology and witchcraft and so on in Europe, interest in those things in Europe too. But in a lot of European contexts, you have cultures that had sort of a single established or semi-established church. That church is sort of abandoned and there's been less void filling. And there's a lot of arguments about why that is. One argument is America, we have this more entrepreneurial religious culture. So it's like, all right, you're not Episcopalian anymore. Come to my seeker-sensitive non-denominational church. Whereas in Europe, it's more like, well, I'm not a Swedish Lutheran anymore, but I'm a Swede, so I still feel like a Lutheran. So I'm not going to go to your weird non-denominational startup, right? There's sort of more of a cultural attachment to residual religious identity that prevents secularization from sort of being reversed or yielding new competitors. That kind of seems to be the dynamic. But then you also have the dynamic of dramatic immigration to Europe changing the religious landscape, which is its own kind of distinctive story. Like, what is the destiny of Islam in Europe? And that, I'm afraid, would have to be a completely different lecture. On the point about corporations, I think you see versions of this in the United States too, in a different way, where there's a strong desire in certain parts of corporate America to have a kind of, it's not religious, but it is the sort of progressive politics as religion model, right? Like the sort of, the language of progressivism, language that you used to hear in the academy from progressive academics 20 years ago, you now hear from HR departments at major corporations, right? And that may be similar to what you're talking about in China, where, when you have when you have sort of a breakdown of other institutions, it might be natural for people to look to, big employers and powerful, sort of powerful non-state institutions as places where a kind of quasi-religious identity could be reforged. Certainly this, you can see versions of this in Silicon Valley. There's kind of a California religion that manifests itself that doesn't have official dogmas, but if you looked at every Google Doodle over a 16-month period, you could probably figure out the Google worldview. But how, and this gets to sort of a core question about the future is, if we've moved to a world of sort of informal, inchoate, individualized spirituality, how does it ever get sort of reinstitutionalized in a more sort of overt and formal way? Maybe it doesn't at all. Maybe it does in unexpected ways. I'm honestly not sure.
My editor wants me to do an investigation, find out exactly how it well, there could be lessons for today, and we might.
Last question.
Who's responsible? Does it matter?
Yes, Mr.
Thank you. I was wondering if you had anything to say about tension within the Catholic Church, specifically on the one hand, in the position of the Pope, as far as currently suppressing the interests of the Latin Mass and the more traditional vein in the Church on the one hand, and then on the synodal path in Germany, which seems to be flouting papal authority going towards the left and sort of the status of the Pope in that tension?
How long do you have? We're about out of time, so I need to liberate everyone. So I'll try and be quick. So my basic view is, you know, to the question that was asked earlier, right? Is there a model of a sort of somewhat traditional Orthodox form of Christianity that's also trying to appeal to the modern world? That was unquestionably what John Paul II was trying to do. Now, John Paul II is remembered as a very conservative pope because he, you know, sort of opposed sort of big adaptations in Catholicism to the sexual revolution. But in many other ways, in terms of sort of his vision of what the church should be like, how it should adapt, how it should change after the Second Vatican Council, he was very much a modernizer, ecumenical dialogue, spiritual outreach. You know, he had sort of a vision of a missionary church in the 21st century. And that, when I became a Catholic in the late 1990s, when John Paul II was, you know, nearing the end of his reign, but in certain parts of the church, there was a sense that like, this was it. This was, you know, this was going to work, right? Like, you know, this was sort of the future of Catholicism, was sort of this mixture of conservatism on some issues with a sort of dynamic, outward looking vision. And then he died, and then came the sex abuse crisis, and then came various other trends. And there was sort of, I think, a legitimate sense that that model had failed and something new was needed, right? And so in the Pope Francis era, you've had essentially a kind of, you know, the Pope himself has sort of opened up debates within Catholicism. But out of that opening up, you've had sort of a flight to the extremes within the church. So liberal and progressive Catholics have felt very empowered by this Pope, even though he has not gone as far as they have wanted to go. He has sort of let them feel like they can sort of experiment. And what's happening in Germany, where, you know, the leaders of the German Catholic Church basically want to liberalize on every front, is sort of the ultimate expression of that, right? Where they've gone well beyond what Pope Francis seems to want to allow, but it's unclear how they can be pulled back. But then by the same token, you've had a large, I think, a number of conservative Catholics who were sort of very content in the John Paul II era church have looked at the Francis era and said, man, if this is where modernization leads, we need more tradition. So there's this kind of, you know, this increasing interest relative to 20 years ago in the Latin Mass, in sort of older views of Catholic theology and Catholic politics, that then is very clearly regarded as a threat by Rome, as like this sort of revanchist upsurge that needs to be crushed. And so you have this dynamic where in reopening debate, Francis has created a kind of rebellion on his right that he's trying to squelch by saying, you know, you can't say the Latin Mass basically without permission from Rome in various ways, and you can't say it in parishes and so on. And this kind of rebellion on his left where it's unclear what he's going to do about it. Like, you know, is the German church in schism? Is he going to pull them back in? No, nobody's really sure. So it's a really interesting landscape, but I really am not sure what, I think the lesson of Catholic history over the last 50 years is how hard it is for any pope, in spite of the authority claimed by the papacy, to sort of settle controversies, to say, once and for all, we've settled these post-sexual revolution debates. That was sort of the model that a lot of John Paul II Catholics thought you had, and I think the Francis era has proven that it, you know, whether or not John Paul II was right in all his rulings, it was not sufficient to settle these arguments at all. And the church is destined to be in this kind of argumentative chaos for a while to come. So,
Well,
God bless us, everyone.
So please join me in